Hello everyone, today we resume our historical region series and we talk about the marches, marche in Italian, and more specifically of the city and later commune of Ascoli. I think I've never made a video about the marches. I think that this is, first of all, the main reason for which making one in the first place, but it's actually a very interesting region. It's admittedly peripheral to most things happening in central northern Italy. They're definitely concentrated in Lombardy, in Tuscany. Those are basically the major basins, right, where most power armies, cities, also by size, etc., are operating. But there is some kind of course, important urbanization and development, artistic production, commercial activities, also in this hilly region on the Adriatic Sea, that just by the fact that it's quite typically constituted by all different valleys, right? There's not a plain whatsoever, right? Didn't have that aforementioned further, say, development, like a regional state of some sort. These territories would fundamentally fall mainly into the Papal States, right? That's the end of it, even though Ascoli is quite close to eventually the boundary with the essentially the King of Naples, that was constituted by the Tronto River, that, as we will see, had an importance for Ascoli throughout its history. I make this comparison because, of course, if you look at the documentation throughout the Middle Ages, there is much less about probably the marches than other areas, but it's still an incredibly violent area, right? It's, to my estimation, it's actually the single most traumatically violent, vicious, and brutal province in Italy. As a matter of fact, during the communal struggles, the only very few things we know regarding the major power struggle dynamics in intercommunal clashes, etc., is that the Marquesans were basically killing each other continuously, right, throughout all their history. This makes it actually way more fascinating. Naturally, it's not really an obscure area, as we will see now with Ascoli as well, but there are other cities we can discuss. Ancona, right, a republic, maritime republic, that, however, can't just make maritime republics. I care about this sort of less known, but unjustifiably so, right, the continental dimension of the Italian peninsula. But there is, in fact, much regarding this. Even the strategic relevance of the center basically was the largest, like in the interland, after Ancona, that was, in fact, more maritime based and so not too involved in the interland, were other cities like Fermo. Now that I think about that, I made a video about the Duchy of Spoleto that is technically in Umbria, but that, as we'll see now, encompassed what will become the marches as well. It's fascinating to observe these lines because they are fundamentally beyond the Papal States coming from the north, right? So that, as we've seen in the Duchy of Spoleto, that the latter's polity was basically yet another chunk of the Holy Roman Empire south of the Papal States. And there is much strategic relevance connected with that, especially in the case of Spoleto and especially the Apennine passes. Ascoli is a bit further south and sort of not that overwhelmingly central in this mechanism, but right, it also constituted an important center to observe. Now, we start from ancient history because naturally all these cities, as we've seen, virtually all of them, have a Roman foundation and continuity and tradition since ancient times. They never die out and maintain the sense of municipal identity within themselves. Now, according to an Italic tradition cited in ancient literature, Strabo, Pliny, Festus all talk about this. Ausculum, this was the Italic name, was founded by a group of Sabines who were guided by their totemic animal, the woodpecker. Now, this is very interesting because it was a bird sacred to Mars, and the foundation of the city would date back to one of the Sabine migrations of the broader Italic, let's say, character called Ver Sacrum, so the sacred spring fundamentally, and that Indo-European war-bending sort of invasion, like it's a bit like the Sabines rape that the Romans did on the Sabines in that instance, but that really consisted in sending out this community of sacred warriors, right, that had sworn an oath as youth, right, to either win or die, killing all the men of the neighbors, because there wasn't enough space, right, to live in this Apenninic valleys, and to get there, killing the men, gravitating the women, and founding a new city. And in this case, this group of Sabines was guided by the woodpecker, right, under Mars. And the Sabines would have merged from this expedition with other native populations, giving rise to the people of the Picentum, so inhabiting Picenum. That is an area where also, for example, the Flavian dynasty stem from, and that had, as we'll see now, a relevance, right, in central Italy during the social war. Asculum was, according to the legend, the place from which the signal, right, for the massacre of the Roman citizens started back at the beginning of this social war, right, in the theater that can be admired still in Ascoli. According to these legends, by the way, chronologically, Asculum would have been founded 1600 years before the same Rome. Right, there are many cities in Europe, as far as, 3 or lots of them that really boast this sort of, but we were here before Rome because our legend says that, right? In part, of course, it's true. Like even the same Rome was not really founded in 753 BC. It was inhabited since prehistory as well, so it's more a clash of historiographies and localism than else. And in 299 BC, Asculum allied itself with the Romans in the context of the Third Samnite War after the Byzantine one in 269 BC. Asculum became a civitas foederata of Rome, right? So it means an allied city, maintaining a certain autonomy. And Asculum was important in ancient times in Picenum. As a matter of fact, its main center, right, in Roman times, also thanks to the city position on the Via Salaria, which connected the salt pans of the mouth of the Tiber, famously enough, to those of the Adriatic coast, so across the Apennines. In 91 BC, as we were saying before, Asculum rebelled against Rome together with other Italic peoples and started the social war. Right, I made a video about the social war, what this was about. These guys were struggling not to destroy Rome, especially these ones. The only ones who maybe wanted to do that were the Samnites, and they wouldn't have the power for doing that, but for actually getting the Roman citizenship, which actually they say they lost the war, but they ultimately got anyway. It is said that Asculum herself, as we're remembering, sparked the fire by attacking the Roman magistrates in its theater. In 89 BC, after a long siege, the Roman general Cneius Pompeius Strabo finally conquered Asculum, slaughtering, by the way, the leaders of the revolt and sending parts of her inhabitants into exile. The Romans, of course, were not that tender than these populations. Archaeological evidence of this, of the Asculum rebelling against the Romans are the so-called missile acorns, lead projectiles, which were shot by the slingers of both sides during the siege. In some cases, you find inscriptions, particular invectives against the opponent or incitements to strike addressed directly to the object, such as feri, which means to hit, right, to wound in Latin. And you find stuff like it's just like, Happy Easter, sort of bombs, etc. Some bullets of this kind, by the way, are inscribed with the name of the Roman leader, Strabo, right? That was leading the siege. So we're pretty sure that they date back to that time. On December the 25th, 89 BC, according to what at least the triumphal fasti tell us, the triumph of literally Asculanes Picentibus, just remaining the classical pronunciation for this time, was celebrated. And with the end of the social war, these populations, as we've seen in Italy, received Roman citizenship. This was the case of Asculum for 88 BC. The city was registered with the Fabia tribus and became a municipium. And so it followed basically the rest of Italian history. During the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, for example, Asculum sided with Caesar. Under whom in 49 BC, in fact, the municipium took definitely the name that is basically known also in Italian today, that is Asculum Picenum. And because there is another Asculum that is in southern Italy, and this one is, so you get the distinction there of the name as ancient in time. Ascoli of the Picenum, right? During the second triumvirate, the city also obtained the honorific title of triumviral colony. We do not know exactly why. Perhaps because Asculum, or by the way, it's the same like Ausculum or Asculum, right? It's spelled in different ways. Eventually came to as Asculum without the U, but it's not a mistake. And perhaps, again, this connection was due to the fact that the city was the birthplace to Publius Ventidius Passus, the partisan of Mark Antony who crushed the Parthians and celebrated a triumph, and so bringing prestige to his birthplace in central Italy. The consular road, as we've seen, that connected Rome to the Adriatic, the Via Salaria, passed through the very city. Right, this guaranteed, of course, a stronger connection with Rome in general. And at the time of Augustus, when Italy was divided, as we've seen in different videos, into 11 regions, Asculum was registered in the 5th Italian one, in fact, the Picenum. So it basically maintained the role of capital, right? At least it was one of the main centers. There were others as well. Today we do not look at ancient history specifically, but it's definitely a city that appears as the major one in the area. And so, skipping imperial times, not much clamors at least happened with the city at its center. We get to the 4th century AD, when Christianity spread to Ascoli through the work of the first city bishop, Emidius. Originally, we mentioned it before randomly, from Trier, right, from Augusta Treverorum in Belgica, today in Germany actually, but as you know, on the left bank of the Rhine. This bishop, right, by the way, this speaks of course already of the early ecclesiastical and European internationalism, let's say, suffered martyrdom under Diocletian. Randomly, we were talking about the Christian persecutions of Diocletian just yesterday in that video about the emperor. And the reason why he was killed was having converted Polisia, that was the daughter of the Roman prefect Polemius, that was not particularly happy with this. It was a pagan. In any case, Ascoli's cathedral today is dedicated to Saint Emidius, the protector of the city. Right? All these Italian, all cities technically had their own saint protector, but of course that built up the sense of communal specificity further, especially now that, as you know, the empire is not faring too well, and so these centers and the local diocese are ever more important for the administration of the city. During late antiquity, following the administrative reforms wanted by Diocletian and Constantine, the territory of Ascoli became part of the Picenum suburbicarium, right? So in other words, this was more connected to Rome than other parts of it. This was essentially one of the provinces that made up the broader diocese of Italy. Just yesterday, again, we talked about what were the dioceses, not in the Christian sense, but in the, say, imperial administrative one under Diocletian, that eventually also helped the development of the archdiocese boundaries and so on. But this is to remark the fact that Ascoli was that important still at that time. And with the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire, Ascoli followed the fate of the rest of the peninsula. Essentially, Odoacer took over, we can witness important changes within a century. Of course, it will shape a bit the city itself, with Odoacer that, for example, re-established or reinforced the Institute of Hospitalitas. New groups of individuals of Gothic origin, even before the arrival of Theodoric, were settled in the city. Interestingly enough, this is an important pattern. Let's say the Apennine and the Alpine areas were the preferential areas of settlement of these Germanic soldiers, because they controlled, in fact, the passes, so that they were the most strategically relevant areas, and were sort of far from the was short distance, but they were not like in the lowlands where there were the bigger cities, the more Romanized, the areas that, say, at least were not particularly happy of seeing these barbarians settled. But this is quite fascinating, because mainly because of the Italic settlement that had taken similar forms at the beginning, and these other migration era waves you can see still in today in the Italian sort of phenotypical characteristic distribution, that these certain islands of the Apennines are probably populated by more people with blonde hair and blue eyes. And this surely has to do with these movements. At the arrival of Theodoric and the Ostrogoths, we see, in fact, yet another settlement, not just of the Amali Goths, but also of the Sarmatians. Right? I made multiple videos about the Sarmatians, the Alans specifically. So these were also settled there. Other groups from Illyria, according to, by the way, the assignments of the senator Petrus Marcellinus Felix Liberius, considered that, as we explained many times in our videos about, say, the Goths, the Romano-Gothic kingdoms. At this point, Italy was run civilly by the Romans, right? The Goths made the army, but the rest functioned exactly as it had always been working before. So this was, as we've seen, mediated just by the senatorial figures that were basically still the masters of the largest estates. Then we know how things went from the killing of Amalasuntha, the daughter of Theodoric, the Gothic War, and so all the disastrous issues that in the first half of the 6th century affect the peninsula, and also Ascoli, which was temporarily handed over to the Byzantines from specifically 535 to 542. Precisely in those years, you find disastrous natural phenomena, brutal coldening of the weather, apparently. It's described by contemporary sources, an epidemic, right, the Justinian end, plague around 541. So these are tough times, especially for these areas that are not, say, even the single most developed or resourceful as such. Together with these material issues, of course, also the spiritual ones were changing. The birth of monasticism in central Italy occurred in this period, right? It must be seen also in the broader context, not just religiously, but for what these monastic communities represented for the rest of the population, right? Embracing the vows of a monastic life often meant identifying the only personal lifeline, right? Monasteries began to become points of reference for many people that had been left alone and filled part of the social needs of the period throughout hospitality, right? The material poverty of these times is famous. Just after the Gothic War, doesn't matter how actually rich this land still was by Mediterranean standards, still, it was a rough time, especially after the plague. And of course, the monasteries were not just a welfare system, but they literally offered an example, right, of lifestyle that could be imitated profitably, right, living with less, but say more functional way. I made lots of videos about this, the one of St. Aquitius, for example, in the time of Gregory the Great, etc. But here we're talking probably also different, say, at the very beginning of monasticism being connected with Ascoli in some way in these regions of Western Europe. Saint Benedict of Nursia is attested to have visited Ascoli in 542 when Epiphanius was bishop of the city. The patron of Europe, definitely through the Benedictine order, and spread at this point. Popular tradition has it that it was the same Saint Benedict to have founded the Abbey of Saint Mary in Holy Mountain, that is near Civitella, an area, let's say a town near Ascoli, that is, however, today in another province, the one of Fermo, in the south, and also in another region, because that's Abruzzi, the Abruzzi technically. But at this point in history, of course, that's especially those boundaries did not exist historically. Also, this is just a legend, but it tells you how, let's say, rooted the importance of monasticism this era was for the area. More likely, Saint Benedict may have only founded the first nucleus in Aspurwort. It was also important just to take refuge, for example, during attacks. These are the very years of the Gothic War, by the way. And as you'll see, Ascoli suffered of Totila's Ostrogothic counteroffensive against the Byzantines. The city was besieged, in fact, in 544-45, and according to the Auctarium, in the appendix to the Chronicon of Marcellinus Comus, Totila besieged Ascoli in the same on this occasion. When the king entered the city, finally, he let the Byzantine troops leave with all their loot, and then he had the civilians plundered and massacred, allegedly so. We don't know exactly what happened, but it's evident that the city suffered from this. The source says, "Crudelitatem suam in Romanos exercuit eosque omnes nudit et necat." This was the same Totila that was actually promising the, say, properly liberty to the peasantry as such. So here Asculum was likely attacked in the aristocratic element that had backed the Byzantines up to that point. But these are also sort of voices almost shrouded in myth. In fact, according to Procopius from Caesarea, the opposite is true. Ascoli was besieged in 545 and capitulated without bloodshed. Right? Definitely, Totila could have again struck the elite, but not really had many reasons to destroy further these communities that were also necessary to support this Ostrogothic coming back. In any case, the final defeat of Teia in 552 marked, as we know, the end of the Ostrogothic kingdom. As a consequence, Ascoli returned under the dominion of Constantinople through the newly established Praetorian Prefecture of Italy. I recently made a video about the title is After the Gothic War, that briefly talks about how Italy was reorganized under this system, but I also made other videos about the same period in the region. So you can just check that in the early medieval history playlist. Paul the Deacon, in his Historia Langobardorum, describes Ascoli as being part of the 12th province, together with Fermo, Penne, and Atri. These are important towns around Ascoli that, as we will see, would play, in fact, significant roles in the political and military history of the city. The Longobard author also states in the same work that Narses, that, as you know, had been put at the government of Italy after the war, would often call for help from the barbarian populations against the frequent incursions of the Franks, that at this point had exploited the collapse of the Gothic power and the exhaustion of the Byzantine one to launch some raids with some bands, nothing threatening in a territorial sense, but together with the Alemanni as well, plundering, say, this already helpless cities. There was also the problem of eradicating the last strongholds in the hands of the Ostrogoths, that, however, would largely remain where they were, just like the Vandals in Africa. I mean, many were deported as well immediately, but especially in the north against the Franks, there was some kind of continuity in that settlement. This is just for saying that, as we know, units of Longobard warriors had already been settled in Italy way before Alboin invaded the peninsula in 568. We think especially that the Duchy of Benevent was already existing before the same invasion. Right? Some war bands had been left there by Narses, and eventually they simply autonomized themselves and joined basically the broader Longobard people as it moved into the north. It is certain, however, that the Picenum region was affected by the Longobard invasion coming from the north between 572 and 74. Right, these were territories, again, like the entire peninsula, that were in the hands of the Byzantines. There was, in fact, an imperial counteroffensive under the Byzantine general Baduarius in 575-76, which failed. Right, in 578, Ascoli was, in fact, besieged by the Longobard Duke Faroald I of Spoleto. We talked about him in the video about the duchy, in fact, who annexed Ascoli to his dominion. So hence Ascoli came to be part of this Longobard, quite important Longobard duchy. It was also, in the sense, the closest to Rome, was the sort of looming threat just across the Apennine, and also admittedly the most rebellious among all the Longobard ones, right? Contrary to what is commonly said, the Longobard duchies were basically loyal, right, and recognizing the actual Longobard authority. The complete opposite was thrown around by a completely incompetent historiography at the time. But the exception being truly Spoleto, for reasons that have to do with the fact it was, in the Apenninic heartland, in between, like, this area of sort of wavering power, the Byzantines, but trying to remain autonomous from sort of the centralistic push of Pavia, that, however, couldn't quite really the Longobards did subjugate, Longobard kings subjugated Spoleto on multiple occasions. I mean, it wasn't definitely much of a threat again to the unity of the kingdom, but just for saying that they tried at some point to side with the Byzantines, the Exarch at Similia. Ascoli, by the way, by the time of Faroald's siege was exhausted, so basically they decided, okay, well, the Longobards had the upper hand in that struggle, and they would maintain, in fact, the initiative later on. So this, say, the Byzantines wouldn't really have any power to take, especially Ascoli, back. They wouldn't kind of even care more than much. The monk Augustine, who had encouraged Ascoli not to give up to the Longobards, was killed together with his children, interestingly enough. So this is yet another case of violence behind which we can see still a connection with the imperial authority rather than particular Longobard ferocity against the Catholics. The Longobards we do not have any evidence of anti-Catholic persecutions under the Longobards that within a century were fully Catholic themselves. In any case, the monk's memory was preserved and his ashes were buried in the Ascoli Cathedral, as well as you understand was gaining also in power in the meanwhile. The Longobards occupied the territory of Ascoli, likely through, we made so many videos about this topic, but through the normal hospitalitas system for how it could work now without a proper Roman state. Essentially, you have the payment of a share of the harvest to sustain basically the army of the Longobards that were settled through the fare, right? Single clans basically had used to be self-sufficient in Central Europe, and that now we're finally settling down in the Piceno, all right? The proof that, let's say, the Longobards had really nothing against the church is proven also by the fact that the local institutional customs remained unchanged. Actually, the importance of the church increased, right? It would work together with all these elements of society to remain as an important institutional stronghold, and sort of the Longobard aristocracy was involved in the same thing. The bishops positioned themselves as an element of not only religious but also civil representation of the city. This was typical again of the era. The Longobards soon integrated within the same. So again, a further reinforcement of the sort of municipal importance of Ascoli, in spite of this tidal waves that had hit the region and all the problems. Needless to say, and as we were recording actually at the beginning, the barbarian invasions in the Greek Gothic War did not bring to the extinction of Ascoli. Right, there were some minor towns in Italy that sort of were wiped out by the events, but let's say the main cities, the main municipia were to remain, especially with these major centers scattered all across the peninsula, remained active. Right, you don't have like in other areas of Europe essentially a true, never a full but still a substantial eclipse of urban culture. Right. The bishop was central into this, but also the Longobard dukes operated through notoriously civil institutions. They adapted quite quickly to the Roman reality. Again, if you're interested in Longobard history, I made many videos. There is a playlist about it. You can really check that out. There's no greater myth than the alleged barbarity of the Longobards, given that they basically had the single most civilly advanced kingdom in Western Europe, right, on the Roman basis, and thanks to their legislation on it. So it's just, if one does not know this objectively, you can't take it as an indicator of complete illiteracy in medieval history whatsoever, because it's just you're not at that level to know anything else to a satisfactory level, say, of depth. Monasteries also remain, these marquees and valleys, the essential points of reference. The monks with the rules were hard-working, hospitable, devoted, cooperative with both civil and religious power. Yes, there were some contrasts, especially with the latter, because secular monastic institutions didn't like too much each other within the church, but the monks provided asylum, controlled the territory in their own ways. They started becoming more powerful. They paid incomes were still cultured custodians of written and oral traditions. The Longobards themselves would have very important dialogue with the monasteries, keeping them as important points of reference, also for strengthening their own power. It's no coincidence that under the Duchy of Spoleto, the Abbey of Farfa became years later the strongest potentate in central Italy. That stretched its influence, in fact, even across the Apennine into the Picenum. Right, Farfa is in Sabina, right, the northeast of Rome. But again, these monastic signories, in a way, were that signory maybe is too much, but I mean the idea that they had this important patrimonial capacity stretching across the Apennine and interplaying with the Pope, with the Duke of Spoleto, etc., made them extremely powerful. The finds from the Longobard tombs of Castel Trosino testify the acquisition by the Germanic rulers of elements of Italic and Byzantine culture. This is also evidenced by an unprecedented religious, dimension, right, within, Christendom. Castel Trosino, famously enough, is also providing us with some of the best arms and armor evidence of the Longobard era, right? The Longobards, in this sense, were maintained. This was sort of still frontier area with the Byzantine border one way or another. As you know, the Longobards were quite militarized. They had an equestrian culture, folklore, history of folklore goes that the famous quintain tournament of medieval Ascoli, such as all the various sort of games that since ever had kept up sort of local militias with horse training. Think about the Ipica Gymnasia in Roman times, or these other Astiludia, and what would become tournaments, in fact, in the Middle Ages, really show, right? We know that the Southern Longobards especially had some sort of similar game. They had to pierce on horseback the skin of a viper hanging from a tree. It was a very old Germanic custom, right? If you look at Norse mythology, the concept of the snake being this fact symbol of major evil, and when initiating themselves to their war bands, they would eat the skin of the snakes that they had pierced through their spears, and consolidate their bond and pushing from this level of like slaying the dragon and eating it to the underworld, to heaven, right? So that's also what leads into to European knighthood, to these customs, these festivals, this practice. There was, interestingly enough, an important horse breeding tradition in the area as well that seems to have been reinforced by the Longobards further, which triggered also some important agricultural, let's say, new ways of land exploitation, let's put it in this way. Different types of land rotation, sowing fields for also the horse pastures, and their food, etc. It was particularly relevant, right, for the quality of the crops, the new types of seeds, right, necessary for organic fertilization and excellent horse manure. In the meantime, around the year 584, the Exarchate of Italy was established by the Byzantines, and it basically brought to the compaction under this political and military district grouping, in fact, all the territories of the Praetorian Prefecture that had remained under Byzantine control, right, and specifically the peninsular ones. At the same time, the Longobard duchies, after the interregnum, followed to the death of Alboin and the short-lived rule of Clef, elected as King Authary, the son of Clef. He was a pro-Catholic, and he was basically the true founder of the political and territorial power that we know as properly the Longobard Kingdom. He fought relentlessly against the Byzantines, but even more those Longobards that had actually settled as federati of the empire, that were really controlling a lot of land in Italy. The Longobard success against these rebel dukes also rendered the kingdom safer from the attacks of the Franks and the Byzantines that had joined forces to try to wipe out at some point Longobards from the Po Valley. Ascoli is fundamentally peripheral to these events. But the important here is the presence of the Byzantine corridor that connected Ravenna to Rome, and which the Longobards were unable to conquer due to the difficulty of besieging some important strongholds, such as Narni, Amelia, Todi, Gubbio, Perugia. We have seen especially the latter role in a similar video to this, which means that Ascoli was located near to, after all, a hot frontier, right? Not a particularly tumultuous one, after all. Especially in the 6th, the 7th century, again, the entire system is very much exhausted everywhere. In the world, you have what Luttwak would call low-intensity warfare going on. But of course, for these small communities, these clashes were important enough, right? There were surely, troops from Ascoli participating into the raids into this corridor. Generally speaking, the Longobards won, right? So the Byzantines did take some measures, etc. We also don't know exactly when and where Byzantines and the Longobards ruled along the corridor. Some strongholds passed from one side and the other during raids, coups, sieges, etc. alternatively. In any case, this would also mean that, given the permanence of the Byzantine corridor, Ascoli remained, together with the Duchy of Spoleto as a whole, for a long time, that is, a century and a half until Liutprand's reunification, cut off from the most important commercial routes with the Po Valley, that of course could be reached, but let's say in between you still had the Exarchs, and so as we've seen, the same Spoletans were relatively happy to be sort of distant politically from the king's palace in Pavia. And you have, in the early Middle Ages, the typical subsistence economy, some trade with southern Italy, and this probably marked also a certain propensity towards the latter direction, especially the territories that would become the ones of L'Aquila, that was founded by Frederick II in the 13th century. It did not quite exist, but Pescara along the Adriatic coast, and this sort of, because of the print of the Duchy of Spoleto, politically and territorially, connected this whole area, let's say from, in fact, the Pescara to the north, like Ancona, Pesaro, right, towards Romagna. It was, in fact, the land of the Exarch, the Romagna. And this is what essentially constitutes the border of the marches, in fact, right? From one side you have the sea, from the other the Apennine, and so the whole thing develops latitudinally. And this is why, by the way, in this peripheral position, this land came to be known as the Marches. especially in Carolingian times, that brought up the name specifically, also because there were the marches of the empire in the south, but giving name in fact to the region. You have some Romagnol as well as Abruzzese influences. Ascoli is shifted towards the south if you look at the map. Consider that in the tumultuous events of this area in 591, the Duchy of Spoleto was ruled by a new duke, Ariulf, right, that had previously been in the service of Constantinople, and that essentially, in order to avoid retaliation from the Longobards king that had consolidated his position, changed sides, right, and essentially began to harass the exarchate, and this was, as you've seen, something intermittent between Spoleto and Ravenna specifically, but also against Rome, right? Ariulf came to besiege the same urbs several times. The Duke of Spoleto would never quite, in Longobard times at least, enter Rome, but it's worth appreciating that again through the Sabine region, Ascoli participated in these raids into Lazio. I made a video about medieval Lazio, by the way, explaining the sort of important proximity of the Spoletans to Rome, and so the Spoletans with this broader territory, as we've seen, connected to it. In any case, the beginning of the 7th century, the age of Rotary, the Longobards and the Byzantines reach a sort of agreement, right? The Byzantines eventually recognize the Longobard conquest of the territories that were in fact in that Germanic possession. They would give up because the empire is engulfed in the Islamic invasions. Like Italy is the least, especially in the central part, northern part, that the Byzantines care about at this point. It doesn't make sense to invest resource there. And this brings to some sort of homogenization, of course, between the Longobard and the Byzantine-held areas, and there is this sort of the Longobards maintained initiative. They gradually erode the Byzantine territory, but the whole situation is pretty crystallized to some degree, and stabilized and pacified even. Then the major changes occur with the Frankish invasion. We already described in the video about the Duchy of Spoleto how the latter reacted to the Carolingian invasions. They dedicated themselves to the papacy. This is a very important moment because the duchy can't do much on its own. They fear stronger Frankish control, and so they tend to associate themselves with what would become the papal state, in spite of the fact that the duchy as such would remain an important lay stronghold of the empire, right, in fact territories that would be considered as part of the papal states. I mean, they overlapped in the sense that there was a patrimonium of St. Peter that really was made up not just by a territorial continuity, but I mean all the possessions that were individually brought together, and still a sort of a lay imperial attempt to say, okay, well, but here, as far as the temporali are concerned, the investiture controversy, we want to rule. So again, made lots of videos about this. There is an entire playlist about the investiture struggle. But also, again, if you look at these regional series episodes, you find sort of more juicy information about the single places, how they reacted to this, and so on. Naturally, as the duchy was preserved, Ascoli remained linked to Spoleto throughout its whole time. And so this lasted throughout the Carolingian era, the Teutonian one. We've seen how the duchy would eventually dissolve itself as together with essentially the imperial authority in the 13th century. But it still had maintained important connections, and also with Germany, there were many of these Spoletan dukes were actually from the German kingdom, up to fairly late till the reign of Frederick II. We will see this better because with the southern frontier, the Hohenstaufen were around. But it's also important to stress how these dukes, of course, were delegating power in the same Ascoli, right? These other communities subjected. For example, around the year 1000, the Count Odmund, without heirs, like this was a guy within the duchy rather than the duke, but still, connected with ducal power, entrusted the civil government, this is a very important passage, of Ascoli to the local bishop Emmone. Now, this is relevant because you see that there is also a dissolution of feudal ties to some degree, and the history, especially of the southern marches, is somehow confused. Sometimes we don't even know the names of the Spolitan dukes, as we've seen in the relative video. But this shows that the city, and so the diocese within it, really increased greatly in relevance. We've seen in other videos, especially about northern Italian cities, so the ones that were properly in the center of the Italic kingdom, at least the bulk of what had been the Lombard one, the one from which eventually the later emperors would issue the most important capitularies also for the rest of the empire. Think about the Constitutio de Feudes, that there, especially in Ottonian times, the episcopal power had skyrocketed. First of all, as we've seen before, cities were more powerful, but the emperors really entrusted to the bishops an enormous comital power. Here, it's something on a smaller scale. It's interesting that it happened in Ascoli because, yes, it was still part of the empire, but let's say you wouldn't say Ascoli is not so much at the center of, say, imperial policy like, I don't know, Asti or Aquileium. I made a video specifically this pair because of the disproportionate episcopal power that they achieved, also in a civil sense through the comital title. But needless to say that, of course, also the Ascolan case fits the dynamic of the so-called bishop counts. With Conrad II, the emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, you have a special diploma granting the right of mint and feudal lordship to the same Bishop Bernard I in 1037, which is the same year of the Constitutio de Feudes, by the way. Ascolan ecclesiastical power was so consolidated that the Emperor Lothar II also granted the bishop presbyter the title of prince in 1138, showing how, after all, Ascoli still, in the grand scheme of things, was relevant enough, in spite of the peripheral errors, maybe exactly because of the same, because Ascoli doesn't have a major urban, say, power, military force, right, etc., but it still doesn't keep within its boundaries, right? So this is important to stress. So we'll see now, because the commune fought also a lot of wars against its neighbors. And this is in fact the moment in which Ascoli is dragged on several occasions into the larger struggle for dominance in Europe between the so-called Guelphs and Ghibellines. We talk about them, we know what we're talking about. In 1183, the city becomes a free commune. You see here that the timeline for communal development is slightly shifted later times, because it's not the same urban development as in the north, but still Ascoli provides itself with its own communal government. In 1185, a popular uprising overthrew the power of the bishop prince, that evidently had not managed, after all, to maintain that great prerogative, and proclaimed by themselves the commune, right, with this acquired prerogative. However, not even the commune was that granitic, and together, say, just like other cities in Italy, also greater sort of statal orientation, Ascoli was, as a commune, undermined by factional struggles between the most prominent families. The most famous ones being likely the lords d'Acquaviva, especially Andrew, the member of the family. There were important medieval noblemen in Ascoli that were directly involved in the political vicissitudes of the city. Other names are the Guiderocchi and the Saladini. These were, again, feudal, say, military clans, right, to be specific, living de facto feudal knightly lifestyle, but in the city. The marches were, let's say, a bit more hybrid, as we've seen in terms of communal and feudal power, relatively undertoned. So the communal development is overshadowed by these greater clans that straddle, say, across the city and the countryside. And so they're also involved in neighboring regions, especially as mercenaries. And so there are quite dynamic individuals that know how to tackle, say, also to encumber and communal power, could have tried to tame them. But they're still connected to the municipal pride. All right. By the way, the commune developed further, creating new institutions. Manufacturing, trade were strengthened. A large group of house towers erected by the noblemen as their palaces in travertine, and this is something you can't see in the city as well. It's all white in stone, and this tells you how, after all, powerful the city is. It's pretty, even isolated in a way, but it's pretty bulky. It's connected. In order to enter the city, you have to cross from one side a bridge over the river. There's steep hills all around. I mean, it's a world on its own, if you want. Ascoli, however, in spite of this, experienced sacking and destruction by the imperial armies of Frederick II. Ascoli had sided with the Guelphs at some point, and it's on this occasion that it seems, at least on the base of our evidence, that as many as 91 of the 200 house towers erected by the nobility adorning the city, major and all skyscrapers, sort of this kind, were demolished by imperial forces. That was a heavy blow, of course, but still not all, right? And of course, the objective of these house towers were to control the entire city from the above. Today, around 50 of these towers can still be identified archaeologically. Some are intact, right? Ascoli, some of the pictures inserted here show it clearly. Others were resized and incorporated into buildings. Others still reused as bell towers. Others we have just the foundations of. But it's a remarkable archaeological legacy. And having rebelled against imperial authority, yet again after the death of Frederick II in 1250, Ascoli was, however, subjected again to the Hohenstaufen in the person of Manfred, who in 1266 subjugated the city as well. These are important years because they are the moment of peak of Manfred's power, also in Tuscany. We've seen it in other videos. Essentially, Ascoli is part of the empire, but the Hohenstaufen from the natural son of Frederick II, in this case, from Sicily, from the Kingdom of Sicily, the south, the Abruzzi, we've seen, essentially expands its power north, right? And so Ascoli is just there, and it gets subjected. But Manfred's adventure, as you know, is short-lived. In a few years, with the victory of Charles of Anjou, Ascoli returns under the authority of the Holy See, that at that point had become fundamentally victorious over the Ghibellines, right, with the successful Angevin crusade. These territories of Spoleto also are pretty much cut out, with the during the German interregnum. Eventually they're sort of given up, and they are by the kings of the Romans, and they're encompassed within the Papal States. And so you have this gradual absorption of the city into the pontifical domain. Initially, given that the Papal States were not that, as you know, centralized and uniform, and Ascoli was just on the other side of the Apennine compared to Rome, etc., the city was given wide autonomy, right? And this opened, we are at the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century, the greatest peak of medieval civilization, especially in communal Italy. Right? This is it's the moment of greatest splendor in Ascoli's history, as for many other cities at the time. This is the reason why Ascoli gives itself, also given that it had expanded importantly, 2 councils, the general one made up of 800 members, and the so-called special one made up of 200. At the end of the commune there is sort of mayor, which is interesting because it's not exactly what other communes worked like, at least, however, there is a seigneurial direction, as we will see that the city takes anyway, in a more common fashion. At the end of the 13th century, the captain of the people's office is created. This had essentially the task of defending the interest of the commoners through popular militias. Right, it was a way to try to curb the power of the nobility in the city streets, right, and negotiating from that, the force of that military instrument. And at the siege of this is the beautiful palace that is essentially the most important landmark of Ascoli, that is built, in fact, in what is still called the People's Square, because the cities were structured like this, right? Say that the people had one area. It depends, right? This could overlap with the church, the cathedral square, the market square, etc. And this overlapping testifies, in this case, the importance of the people of the office. So also in this Marquesan reality, where again the popular movements, properly the popular regimes are not that strong compared to, again, places like Tuscany. There had been an important growth of the lower classes, and also Ascoli had its phase, right, in this kind. And in 1288, there is even a pope, Nicholas IV, that is elected, who was from Ascoli. He was born as Fra Girolamo da Lisciano, and he's important also because he was the first Franciscan pope, which indirectly testifies to the importance that both the importance that the city had assumed, but also the strong presence of the Franciscans in the same. For tomorrow I have a video on the mendicant orders first, but they already made lots of videos, also one on St. Francis, etc. So, of course, like pretty much everywhere, the mendicant orders were spreading, especially in the urban environment contexts, also as a papal mean of control over the local bishops, very often also in a contrast fashion. Nicholas IV donated his cope to his hometown. Right, this is a rare example of a sacred vestment of English manufacture, interestingly enough, which is preserved in the Civic Art Gallery. And in the last decades of the 13th century, you also have the famous Cecco d'Ascoli. His real name was Francesco Stabili, born in fact, in the city. He was an original as well as controversial figure of man of letters, astrologer, mathematician, philosopher, mostly famous as author of the poem La Cerba and other compositions for which he he mixes a bit like the Sicilian, the Tuscan influences that, especially in a land like Ascoli, it's bordering more or less the two areas culturally, is something that makes you think. Jacob was also an heterodox. Right, he was accused of heresy, and in fact he died at the stake in 1327, which is also fascinating. But violence characterized a bit just like the political military landscape of the marches. As we were saying before, there is no other more violent context that I'm aware of in communal Italy than this one, except for the fact that it's all fragmented, so that it's difficult to document. But again, the few we know is that the marches were just all killing each other happily, more or less. In fact, there were incessant battles against nearby cities. The nemesis, the greatest enemy, neighbor, this is typically among the Italian communes to have visceral hatred towards one specific other opponent. Nearby is Fermo, right? And basically these cities fought for quarter of a millennium for the control of the naval port on the Adriatic that was granted to Ascoli at the mouth of the Tronto River, and that would bring up to from 1256 to 1504 to this constant clash, right? It was all these expeditions across the Marquesan valleys, reaching the sea and raiding all this stuff, right? Fermo was jealous of what had been its ancient naval base, and didn't want Ascoli to have it. But Ascoli was more powerful, and so you have this continuous infight. And in spite of this, or because of this, because it shows, of course, how much power existed at this point in the, again, late 13th, early 14th century, we're talking about the peak also of the medieval military civilization, we see how prosper Ascoli was. The city had its own mint. It extended jurisdiction even over communities on the right of the Tronto River, so basically what is today's Abruzzo. And it had a sort of international connection with Venice, Florence, so again, you can't speak of a great protagonism on the Italian scene for sure, but the clashes between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines were keeping to go on, etc. There is the Henry VII expedition, all this messed up situation would of course make, I don't know, some Ascolis and knights picking their way, going to fight in some of the major battles in Tuscany, especially interfering with the Romagnol, the Umbrian affairs, etc. I'm sure I can make more in-depth videos about this context because they're fascinating, and the marches acquired for this reason a reputation for unruliness, right? Because there was no central city that would be able to hegemonize the region, like, I don't know, Milan for Lombardy, right? It's at Similia. This violent territorial disputes with the neighbor and rival Fermo continued, but there were mostly internal problems, right? The collapse also towards the mid-14th century, with the cries of Black Death, etc., of the communal institutions that were eroded by lords, by these adventurers like soldiers of fortune, etc. In fact, in the same 1348, given the weakness due to the emergency, Ascoli called the Lord of Rimini, in Romagna in the north, Galeotto Malatesta, to rule the city, to bring some order. This included as a mission, like to fight also Fermo. This lord was eventually driven out of the city in 1356 because, again, there was this constant back and forth with the local factions, vertical and horizontal divisions. There is a very interesting. This is the time in which the Pope has gone over to Avignon, but is reflecting regarding the necessity of recovering essentially the Papal States. And there's a very interesting survey that his officials make in the marches, and asking specifically the priests what would have been the best mean essentially to recover the marches. And there is a beautiful answer by a modest priest that, however, had a pretty clear idea and said, quite simply, aside from all the administrative issues, etc., in this age of companies of fortune, etc., in order to recover the control of the marches, you need 500 men-at-arms. This was the answer. And he was right. And this is basically what Egidius Albornoz, that, as you know, was a Spanish cardinal that was sent to the Papal States to recover, in fact, part at least of papal prerogatives in the area, and to reform the administration of these very different territories, but quite patched together ones that the popes had never directly controlled, especially from this side of the Apennine. And that would lead to the famous, in fact, Aegidian, after Aegidius Albornoz, constitutions of 1357. Now, I made a video about the medieval papacy around this time. It explains a bit better what Albornoz did in central Italy. We will get a bit more in depth into that, because it wasn't a miracle, but something close to that, meaning that, again, the heterogeneity of these territories was enormous, and so the cardinal had also to use violence, but also formal recognition, try to build up something that was an order. And in the constitutions, the cardinal included what is written in the Latin sources Esculum, so meaning Ascoli, among the 5 major cities, and especially the noble magis of the marches, that is to say the biggest, say the most important noble centers of the region. In 1377, the statutes of the commune were reorganized. These have also the mention of the aforementioned quintain joust that had refined itself. These games, again, had always been existing historically, but now with the 14th century documentation, of course, we start getting way more info and medieval history in the first place. And there is this passage that says, and then those who on horseback have played the in here it's in Italian vernacular, but it's very similar to Latin, by the way. It says have played the asto vero armigiato, that is to say the astiludium, like the clash with the lances raising, or the arm, I don't know how to translate this, but the way they would do this with arms, basically. If they want, they can run at the quintain, the which said Kammerling has it done, like the other aforementioned things, which is placed in the said Arengos Square, that is in fact today still called the Piazza Arengo. And so this was the ancient tournament that is still held folkloristically in Ascoli to this day, in costume, its usual reenactment, right? And that is also testified, and I'm sure I uploaded here among the pictures, but also by that beautiful 13th century bas-relief depicting a clash between 2 knights that wear armor and charge with lances at the ready, and this is carved in one of the travertine buildings currently set in the Edicule in the Mazzini Road in Ascoli. Ascoli is, again, it's for today, it's a town basically, but you can sense the medieval past because it's all covered in these travertine buildings that are very medieval in nature, and so you can appreciate the wealth of the city. So, as for most of Italy, but even more this area of the center, the Papal States, the events that followed at the end of the 14th and the 15th century are very violent. You have actually a stabilization or an attempt to stabilize lordships, right, that entail fighting. The Holy See is basically trying to guide the system, but of course there are some condottieri that basically take over, and yes, they do it also in the name of the church, but they can be allied also with the enemies of the Pope, so it's all pretty messed up. So you have some lords who dominate in sequence. The Ghibelline Count Filippo Tebaldeschi. Then you have the head of the papal troops Blasco Gomez, the Duke of Atri, the King Ladislaus of Naples, that received Ascoli in fifth dome, even by the church, interestingly enough. The Count of Carrara and his sons, we will see in better now, and even Francesco Sforza, that would become the lord of a large part of the marches from 1434 to 1445. Right, this is the guy, as you know, was would be in charge of Milan. All right. And yes, it was normal. Like the marches here were, let's say, they had lost essentially an autonomous power on its own. As we've seen, they don't even develop a true signory that is capable of sort of creating a regional state of some sort. You have places like Urbino, etc., Montefeltro, etc., but Ascoli, especially in the south, they were mostly exposed, as we've seen here, to Naples to some degree. The conquest of Ladislas I, in fact, witnesses the also the introduction of the Italian commander, the Count of Carrara, belonging to the noble Paduan Carrarese family, to whom this Neapolitan monarch granted the title of Viceroy of Abruzzo and Prince of Ascoli for himself, and for his sons who succeeded him, they were Ardizzone and Obizzo. And this is interesting because it shows how, albeit Ascoli was just a city and Abruzzo was like an entire region south of it, it's still the two titles are separated, and also for administrative reasons, because the former was within the Kingdom of Naples, Ascoli was instead a papal fief of some sort. The Carrara is told to have been buried in the same cathedral of Ascoli. I'm not sure whether that is proven or was moved, I don't know. But in any case, this shows also the attachment of the city to these lords, or at least, the latter's attempt to become more part of the, say, political landscape of the community. Of course, at this point, like the commune doesn't quite have that vitality. There are militias, etc., but it's mostly these professional soldiers that come and go here with this greater power that really dictate the situation. As we've seen, Galeotto Malatesti had started this trend, and he had also contributed to bolster the local defenses. In fact, he had the Malatesta fortress built near the Cecco Bridge over the Castellano torrent. It would be later destroyed, but what you can see today is the restoration by the famous military engineer Sangallo. Right, we're talking about the time of the Trace Italienne. We're in 1540. Right, I talked about Sangallo in some of early modern warfare, siege warfare videos, but it's just a famous name, and it's a massive fortress, of course, in the typical Renaissance guise, but there was the previous medieval one on it, together with other fortresses as 15 with the same house towers within the city. Galeotto has been expelled. You have, we talked about Francesco Sforza, that was also a pretty cruel ruler, as it seems. He was overthrown in 1482. When, however, at that point, couldn't quite get rid of one of these guys and not having anybody around, the commune is forced to recognize the sovereignty of the church, so becoming integral part of the papal states for good. This is relevant because, again, the Tronto River, especially from the 14th century, had become definitively the boundary with southern Italy, right? You know that essentially, if you look at the map of Italy on the Adriatic, the southern part, dialect, etc., arrives up to Tronto, right? From the side of Rome and the Mediterranean. Instead, southern Italy begins more south because it just stops there at some point. So Ascoli is lucky enough to some degree to be part of the Papal States, and at the time, especially to receive what was known as the Libertas Ecclesiastica, which is essentially a broad administrative autonomy, which of course the popes were sort of forced to recognize, because still at this point they didn't have the full statale, uniform, impositive, direct control over all these areas. The Papal States were a massive, glued together cluster of communes, fiefs, a mess. Actually, it was, in terms of military, of manpower, and also the caliber of the condottieri that stemmed from there, easily the strongest. Like, at least if they had been unified, it would have taken over Italy. There's no doubt about this, right? But in fact, it was something else. And part of the reason why it was something else, in fact, it was, some parts were very feudal and military in nature, rather than sort of patrician and urban, like could be Florence, say. These rough Apenninic lords and their military traditions, their war bands, and so on. Now, Ascoli is also famous. I inserted some of these beautiful paintings, in fact, of his, for the settlement and work of the Venetian painter Carlo Crivelli. He's actually very famous if you studied history of art, but it's not a name you hear that often. This guy came to live in Ascoli in 1469. The Venetians dominated the Adriatic. They had issues with Ancona, right? They just, like, this was for other reasons, but still, the Venetians are around. They have the most beautiful panel of the Annunciation that is now preserved in the National Gallery in London, though it was made in Ascoli. And so you have, in the second half of the 15th century, Ascoli experiencing a high-level cultural phase, which manifests itself not just through Crivelli, but other names like Enoch of Ascoli, Cola Pizzuti, Pacifico Massimi, and Antonio Bonfini. Crivelli painted also the splendid polyptych of St. Emidius, that, as we've seen, was the patron of the city. This work of art is preserved in the Chapel of the Holy Sacrament in the Ascoli Cathedral. You have, by the same author, the Madonna of Poggio di Bretta, that is preserved at the Diocesan Museum. The two triptychs of Valle Castellana in the Civic Pinacotheque. And you have really a lot of Ascoli works of art of the period scattered many museums around the world. Crivelli died in 1495. He had a notable pupil, the valuable Austrian Pietro Alemanno. Alemanno stands for Alaman, German. Right? And he was the author of polyptychs commissioned by some groups such as the Slavic and Albanian communities that were settled in the Ascoli area as well, because this is at the time, of course, of the Ottoman invasions, and so all these peoples from the Balkans are fleeing across the Adriatic. Most of them going in the Neapolitan kingdom. In fact, there are some islands of these people historically settling there, also as military communities of Stradiots, etc. But Ascoli is just very close. So they have these Slavs and Albanians settling there, having their own aristocracies, etc. This immigration from the Balkans, from Illyrian times in the Bronze Age, etc., had been a thing. Famously enough, there were some Illyrian populations in Italy as well, down south. The Vanini family is very famous too in the city because of goldsmithing, through which Ascoli reaches levels of excellence, to say the least. In spite of the fact that the political life is not that pink, let's say that there is a continuous unrest between opposing factions, the disease of abundance, if you want. You have decades of rebellions, massacres, raids. You have the growth of banditry. Definitely the decline of civil virtues to some extent. Still, there are Guelph and Ghibelline hatred, which is something which you would think, well, it ended, right? You know, at this time, Guelph Ghibellines, it's a medieval thing. No, in the early modern era, actually, this thing goes on. And exactly because of the connections that existed with the empire, right? Never underestimate them. We've seen here an Austrian coming to work in Ascoli, and so you know that these communities were interconnected. You have families like the Guiderocchi, the Malaspina, that took over the city, but what fundamentally you have is a continuous state of war between gangs in the city and the countryside, you know, with all the violence you can imagine. In 1502, Ascoli renounced its autonomy to further consolidate the direct control of the Holy See, to escape the tyranny of factional struggles, right? And this essentially stabilizes the situation to some degree, right? There are also interesting practices in Ascoli, which are mottos and phrases in Latin or Italian that become that are engraved on the architraves of the doors of buildings, etc. That becomes a typical character of the city. There are some of these inscriptions still seen in the Mazzini and Soderini roads. This is for maybe people who are very interested in the city, if they want to leave it, etc. Of course, Ascoli is not one of the first touristic destinations if you visit Italy, etc. But it's a place that really is worth visiting if you know the history. It's just a tranquil place, after all, that bears this remarkable history, which is definitely interesting to have covered in this video. Again, I'm trying to... Of course, there are more important Italian cities still that I have to cover, but I also want to be homogeneous territorially, and so never done something about the marches specifically. I think that the city, of course, deserved a lot of that attention because of its characteristics. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.